Hello there, everyone, and welcome back to Russia in Context. Now, we're back once again with the rubric Uncancelled Culture, where I try to shine a light on modern Russian artists who are doing new and interesting things that are worthy of attention beyond the country's borders, something that the Kremlin doesn't bother much with, despite all of their whinging about Russian culture being cancelled. God forbid they be proactive. Anyway, this time around, I've rounded up what I thought to be the 4 best albums of the first quarter of the year, and with each entry here belonging to a different genre of music, I hope there's something for everyone. First up is Stereopolina with Песни хорошего настроения. This is unabashed synth pop, which leans heavily into the 80s and 90s era of Russian and foreign music, while using sounds more familiar to those of us that remember the last revival of the genre about a decade or so ago. Opener Yasna is the embodiment of all of this, with a bass line that recalls the drive of Decepticon by Le Tigre. Next is Никуда мы не пойдем, which in my opinion is the best track of the album. There's lots of bright sounds and airy synths, but a sense of melancholy throughout. The drive countered with more reserved backing, which is fitting for a song about growing older and choosing to stay in instead of going out and running the town. Plastilin goes for a darker, brooding sound, ping-ponging style synths, like a 180 from the first 2 songs, but it vibes like a 90s techno, kind of like E-Type, without the incessant hi-hat and the BPM dialed back a notch, or maybe like Children by Robert Miles. Transitioning into the latter half of the album, Vdvayom and Zarya are good, with the latter recalling late Soviet-era estrada, and for anyone who doesn't know what the genre is or what it sounds like, the song is a fine taster. In general, though, the second half feels weaker, with the last 2 songs kind of tacked on. One is a cover of Soviet cult band turned modern classic Kino, albeit a rather original take on the track, and the other song is a new version of an older Stereopolina song. The album is solid overall, but it feels like maybe it could have been better off as an EP. Standout tracks are the first 3, Yasna, Никуда мы не пойдем, and Plastilin. Now we get to MiyaGi and Эндшпиль's Narrative, an album that belongs to the genre of hookah rap, a concept which has existed in Russia for some time now, at least a decade. The genre isn't really rap, though it does tend to utilize trap and hip-hop beats. In fact, it probably shares more in common with Middle Eastern music, which is maybe logical as the artists tend to be from the Caucasus Mountain region or Central Asia, which isn't the Middle East, but you get it. It's named as such because it's more for hookah bars, music that vibes and runs in the background without really calling much attention to itself. MiyaG and Endshpil were pioneers of the genre, and one of its biggest names, but to be honest, I never paid much attention to it all, much less actively listened to it. However, early in January, the pair released Narrative, and chalk it up to the time of the year when it was released. It's just kind of a slow schedule in January, or maybe the glowing reviews from a variety of Russian sources, but I gave it a few spins. The first time listening, I was kind of dismissive. It just sounded like the same hookah rap that I had heard as background music, or, the music that you hear distorted from low-riding Ladas, or maybe when Yandex randomly threw it into my shuffle. But upon the second listen, I started to vibe. And that's the whole idea of the music, vibing and grooving. From the opening bars of Pranzai, there's a sense of something powerful coming, and although it's delivered in laid-back, soft-spoken lines, the album just feels uplifting. Although most of you won't understand the lyrics, there's nothing negative in them. They're all focused on love and supporting each other and your friends, making the most out of every day. It's just solid, uplifting stuff. And as I said, you're probably not going to understand what they're singing because it's in Russian. That's also not a huge problem, as one of the key elements of hookah rap is how unintelligible it can be at times due to the thick accents and oddball intonations. It can even be hard for native Russian speakers to get it as well. My favorite example of this is at the end of Novy Den, when MiyaGi sings "Luchiki tepla nam, Лучики тепла нам всем. I couldn't make heads or tails of these lines the first time I heard them until I looked at the lyrics, and then it kind of clicked, and now I kind of love them. None of the songs on the album are skips, but that's largely due to the more forgettable ones still being hookah rap, that background music vibe which allows you to tune it out. The worst songs on the album aren't bad, you just ignore them without trying. Standout tracks would be opener Pranzai, Vashod, my personal favorite, Golgotha, Rka, and Novi Den. For a long time, I thought MiyaGi and Endshpil's narrative was the best album I'd heard in the first quarter of 2024, but they were dethroned not long ago by the next album, Хадн Дадн's Поцелуйчик, солнышка. The first comparison that came to mind when listening to this album was Animal Collective's Merryweather Post Pavilion, an indie classic from 15 years ago, just a certified masterpiece. It hit me in the opening seconds of the album, when the music comes crawling in, along with these reverbed vocals and other errant sounds, before frontwoman Varvara Kraminova's singing joins the fray. There's a warble effect added to her voice, and it gives everything a shaking, melting, unstable sensation. More and more instrumentation comes in, an acoustic guitar, a violin, what is either heavily distorted vocals or heavily distorted strings, ethereal synths, this whole thing building and building to a climax it never quite reaches before it quickly pulls away and disappears. And that's just the first song, and each track on this album deserves just as much attention. They're all packed full of diverse instrumentation, moods, and indie music touchstones. Now, I already mentioned Animal Collective as one that I was reminded of, but while listening to Поцелуйчик, солнышка, there are moments that screamed Los Campesinos, Grizzly Bear, Dirty Projectors, Sufjan Stevens. It's a lot of Baroque pop, let's be real, but that's not to say this is a knockoff of those groups. Not at all. This is all of the great indies from the early 2000s thrown into a blender and then filtered through Russian musical traditions and culture with a dash of modernity tossed in for good measure. Still, there is a lot of Merryweather Post Pavilion vibes, and I'm all here for it. The band described their music as Liao Kin, I think I'm pronouncing that right, a made-up word and genre with Liao, meaning rollicking and with ethnic motifs, and Akin, meaning an understanding of the world through personal experiences. This is reflected in the lyrics with references to modern Russian urban imagery like birch trees alongside the homeless and allusions to war. One of my favorite songs, the album closer Небо над третьим транспортным, has the Moscow 3rd Ring Road as its only visual, a song that repeats the same refrain over and over for its entire length, as circular and endless as the road itself, but the music lifts towards the sky over said road, striving to break away from the traffic and hustle and grime of it all. This is Hadn Dadn's 6th full-length album in as many years, with EPs sprinkled in at that time as well, and it's wild to think that I've slept on the group for this long, but Поцелуйчик, солнышка catapulted them into the center of my attention, and although we're only in April, this stands as an early contender for Russian Album of the Year. There's not a single track I'd skip on this album, but if I had to name a few brilliant standouts, I would say they are Бомж бездомный, Кошелек, the title track, Белый пастушок, and Ivan. So if the best album of the first quarter here in Russia was the album I just spoke about, what is there left to discuss? Well, I wanted to direct everyone's attention to the group Lesnik. A trio out of the Ural region, they play something that varies from post-rock to post-metal, with moments of black metal in between when the guitars and drums really get into it, like on the track Между молотом и наковальней. The reason I'm featuring them here at the end is that these guys are relatively new, and they have released just a number of singles last year before putting out a full-length album, an EP, 2 singles, and a split thus far in 2024. The amount of material that they've released is in just the first 3 months of this year is impressive, and I won't be the least surprised if there's more to come. In terms of actual music, Lesnik live up to their name with music that does a wonderful job of calling to mind the vast taiga of central Russia, with its thick forests. The atmosphere on tracks like Master starts out brooding and ominous, as though something were watching you from the underbrush of the forest, before slowly building up to passages of more sound and more space in a style somewhat reminiscent of Russian circles. It's all instrumental and has a solid drive throughout, and I love playing it when I go out cycling or when I've got to sit down and do work, like putting together my thoughts for yet another video. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, I get that, but I still recommend giving it a spin. Off their EP, Шумлеса, I suggest the first track, Дочь, and off their LP, Нехорошая Квартира, give Master and Plamya a listen. There was so much more that I didn't even manage to listen to these last months, including some releases from relatively large names on the Russian scene. Unfortunately, I didn't get to them. Be that as it may, I hope that you check out some of or all of these artists and that at least one of them tickles your fancy. And for those out there who don't have the time or the patience to sit through a full album, I'll be doing a follow-up video in the coming week that'll highlight the standout singles of the last 3 months, so keep your eyes open and your ears alert for that. For now, though, this has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.